Hello and welcome to the webinar from InfoStretch, Mobile Test Automation Lessons from the Trenches. My name is Manish Mathuria and I'll be walking you through this webinar. All right, thank you for joining the webinar and we'll start now. If you want to get in touch with me post this webinar, here are some of the details. You're welcome to write to me on my email address or connect me with on LinkedIn, as well as you already might know, we have pretty significant blog activity going on about mobile testing and mobile automation, which is pretty near and dear to our hearts at InfoStretch. So please feel free to check out our blogs at blog.infostretch.com. Great. So moving on to walk through mobile landscape and testing challenges. We'll talk about mobile test automation tool categories. So we'll look at the broad categorization of mobile test automation tools. And then we will dive into mobile automation best practices, which is crux of this presentation about, how mobile test automation, how does it differ from, normal desktop test automation or web test automation, and what are some of the best practices around it. Finally, we'll, walk you through a short case study on one of our bigger clients where we tested an automated mobile web application on multiple devices, and this is a Airline Solutions web app. Finally, we'll open up to Q&A, so feel free to write your questions on the online webinar question and answer mechanism, and we'll be happy to answer that. So going right in, let's look at the mobile landscape and how that mobile landscape is reflecting on testing challenges that today's QA teams and test automation teams have to deal with. So mobile is definitely on the fast track. This is some of the data on how mobile landscape is unfolding. As you can already see that the gap between the population, human population out there and the proliferation of mobile devices is closing pretty fast. So we already are over the number of people the world produces on a everyday basis, and if you compare that to the devices that we create, and this is just the smartphone devices and the tablets, we are way over that, right? So basically the point here is that the reach of smartphone devices and mobility in general is happening faster than you and I can imagine. This slide and next talks a little bit about how mobility is getting more and more prevalent in the enterprise space. As we have known, the mobile applications have been for past 2 years, ever since Apple and Android app stores became more commonplace, and we all know about the number of applications that come and get downloaded from these app stores. In past year or so, in the enterprise, there is significant advances in mobile applications. So some of these slides some of this content in this slide and next talk about where enterprises are. So as the second part of this slide shows, there are definitely certain industries in which mobile applications and mobile solutions are very, very commonplace. Healthcare is one of the top ones. Even more, early adopters of technology, as always, is financial applications. Travel and retail industry is big on mobility. So in general, there is a lot of advances in the enterprise world for mobile application, and this gap is going to close in, as fast as it can. There's also an interesting data point that, and this is relevant as of 2009, 2010. I'm sure that it is a lot more prominent now. That it states that 40% of brands out there, which is, enterprise and consumer brands, have developed more than 30 applications. So, if you work for a large company, if you work for enterprise, or you have anything to do with consumers, chances are that you have, more than one application already being worked upon at hand, right? Also, it's important a little bit about mobile development life cycle and how short the mobile app life cycle is to speak intelligently about why testing is important and how it has an impact on testing. And there are obvious reasons for it. As the innovation continues in the mobile space, there is a significant significant number of use cases, the user interaction mechanisms with the mobile devices, customers demand, how your competition reacts to it. There are all these reasons that have an impact on the very short life cycle that mobile applications have. So this is an example of how the evaluation of web browsers, which is one of the most prominent technologies that we have known thus far, that has impacted our the consumer and the end user interaction with the computing devices. In between 2005 and 2011, as the slide says, there were 4 or 5 releases of prominent browsers, right? So Internet Explorer, all the leading browsers, Chrome, Safari, Firefox, etc., had 4 or 5 releases, which approximately means that they are on a release cycle of 12 to 18 months. Now contrast that with a year's release of Android OS, right? We went from version 2 to version 4 all in year 2011. Compound that with the sub releases of this OS and the form factors on which this OS got ported on. So just the level of activity that happens in the mobility space is huge, and it's very significant, and that has a direct impact on how we look at testing of these applications and how we automate them. Again, the same behavior was there on form factors and other operating systems, right? So, the beginning part of this presentation, which I walked through right now, has a message, and the message is that if you work for an enterprise, no matter what industry, right? Obviously, as we see, there are certain industries which are more prominent and certain others which are less prominent. But no matter what industry, whether your C-level executive cares about a BI solution or not, they do care about your mobile app. You will have unique kind of challenges on your development and QA teams. It's here to stay. And, the only way to tackle this is think about how to deal in an agile world and how to deal it with automation, right? So that sets a good stage to the next part of the presentation, which specifically dives deeper into mobile automation, right? So, as we look at mobile automation and the challenges around it, I think it's wise to divide it into categories of prominent automation tools or prevalent automation categories, if you will, of these tools at the technology level. And as we go into it, you will see why. So the way we see it, there are 3 main broad categories of automation tools. One is a set of tools that work at the HTML level, right? So which is working in the browser or in the cross-platform applications, and we can automate these things kind of like how we have been automating websites and web applications, but we can do that on the mobile devices. The second broad category is things that we work on the native platform. And finally, there are third-party tools which we call as platform-independent mobile automation technologies that are available, and they are very rapidly evolving. So, how these tools were in past 6 months is a lot different than how they are right now. And we at InfoStretch take very close look, with this being one of our prime activity, we take a very close look at available tools and technologies out there, and we publish that on our blogs. So, I welcome you to look at our blogs and see how we use some of these tools. So, digging a little bit deeper into these categories, mobile HTML based automation pretty much drives HTML and JavaScript. So, what you have on when you talk about automation, what you have on your web page or your cross-platform app, the tool is trying to drive that. So the tool will recognize every button, every link, every widget on your HTML-based presentation layer and drive it, right? It'll recognize the web control. Of course, the positives are that by virtue of that, it is automatically it works across device platforms. The underlying mechanism of working on the user interface is the automation tool is aware of your objects, and therefore it is very robust and resilient to changes in your underlying app, right? And of course, it is non-intrusive to the application. You don't have to change the application code in order to make it testable, right? The downside is, of course, limited to web and cross-platform and HTML5 apps. So, you can't test native apps using this category of tools, right? The second category, as we discussed, is native platform automation technologies, which means that, with iOS, there is an inbuilt iOS automation technology. With Android, there is a similar one. This is by far the most powerful and most intrusive approach you can get. You can pretty much test anything and everything in your application's user interface. However, it will require code access. It is written specifically for a device platform. So if you have an app that is developed once for Android and once for iOS and once for BlackBerry, you unfortunately have to stick to creating platform-specific automation. So you will be, just like you develop your app 3 times, your test automation code will also be developed 3 times, right? Now, there's this interesting category of platform-independent mobile automation, and for my benefit, I kind of divide that into 2 types, Type A and Type B, right? So Type A is something that actually uses screen-based recording and screen-based optimization. It OCRs is optically character recognizes the contents of the screen, and it helps the test tool actually work with the content that is showing up on the screen by virtue of OCR, right? And the benefit is that it will actually work cross-platform. So since it is working at the screen level, it works across the devices and across platforms. And, the side benefit is that it has access to the whole device. So if you have a scenario where test something on an app and then send an email and then come back to the app and, check the network, etc., it will work across the whole device, not limited to your application, right? But on the downside, it has limited object awareness, and since it relies on image and OCR capture on the device, right? Now, on this basic technology, recently there are several tools that have come up that I call Type B, which actually take this basic approach and then make it more object aware in a device independent sort of way. So using one script, you can actually deal with creating test automation code that will actually work across devices, and it will work in an object-aware way where your automation code actually is dealing with the widgets on the screen, right? So sometimes this could be intrusive, wherein you need to create a special build. You need to compile the tools library within your code for the tool to be more object-aware of your application, such that it can insert test code in your test code in the testing process, right? but it definitely is a lot more powerful than type A, right? So the purpose of defining these broad categories is to help identify what tools would work for what kind of applications based on the application categories or application characteristics, and how to implement that tool best for a particular characteristic, right? So getting into specific best practices or lessons learned around test automation. So I'm dividing these lessons learned into 4 main categories. How to select test cases and devices for mobile automation, what kind of scripting challenges one has to deal with, and how do you really deal with the underlying problem of mobile automation, which is fragmentation. So, even on an Android device, you may have to put smarts in the script such that it can recognize the nuances between 2 different Android devices and deal with it, right? Finally, and then we look at dealing with special device conditions. How do you address that? And finally, what happens when you actually execute test cases? What are some of the best practices that you can build around when you are creating test execution, right? So, device selection. Obviously, the question that we are trying to answer in this is, how do we maximize our test coverage at minimum cost and time, right? The number of devices, depending on what is the objective of your application and who's the target audience, the number of devices that may exist for providing good coverage can be outside the reach of any practical mechanism to test, right? So you may have hundreds of devices on which you may need to test in order to provide good coverage, and that often is not practical. So, one has to figure out how do they maximize the coverage, what mechanism, what technique do they use to do it at the minimum cost and time, right? And these are some of the factors that we look at when we identify what is that device and test matrix that we will come up when we actually do testing and automation, right? So a few of the characteristics are types of the app. So, what is the basic nature, function, and job of the application determines what devices to use for testing and automation, right? So if you are developing a game, certain types of devices will be more prominently used. If it's a business app, certain other types of devices will be more prominently used. A lot of times this information can be available either from the marketing department. We at our company track a lot of this information fundamentally in our devices repository and in our knowledge base, such that we can come up with the right matrix for the right problem, and we typically do that routinely for our customers, right? User personas is another category where, depending on not just the type of the app, but who is using it, right? Is it a teenager using it? Is a business traveler using it? Is this like your typical consumer using it? Is it a social type of app being used by a senior or by a mom? Depending on that, devices matter. Geography, of course, is relevant because there are different devices that are released in different parts of the world geography, and one needs to worry about that. What app functions are possible with a particular device? Again, this means that there are certain devices that have certain capabilities and certain devices don't. So if you are streaming, if your app is written for a specific screen res, all these factors have to weigh in when you are identifying the devices. Also, device popularity. So there is a lot of data that we mine and we track, based on which we can tell what devices are popular in a particular geography, what not, for a certain form factor and OS. So those are some other factors. So, the purpose of doing this analysis is to eventually come up with a device OS test matrix. So the idea is that we will come up with a set of devices and underlying OSs on which we will do certain level of tests. So it would typically look like on the base OS of the device, we will do a full test, and on all the future OSs, we may do like a partial smoke test, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that we will come up with this metric so that when we get into the testing phase, we know precisely what coverage we are getting and why, and how that coverage satisfies our business, right? How do you select test cases? So, and this is particularly for automation. So, for manual testing, your test case selection would depend on, the coverage you want to get and the type of application. But out of that universe of test cases that you have identified, what are good candidates for automation, right? That is a problem, or that is a question we are typically trying to answer. So there are, right off the bat, there are certain test cases which are not automatable. So, the test cases that have interaction with system or peripheral, things that want you to take a picture, and or if there's a barcode scanning type application that you need to scan a barcode and you need to scan multiple different barcodes, it may not be automatable in the normal usage form that you or I would interact with the device, right? There may be other techniques to automate it, as in you could feed in a barcode programmatically to the device or to the app, but in its normal sense, it may not be automatable. So you need to identify that, right? Depending on what tool you use, interaction between multiple apps, OS and application, or multi-domain type of test cases may not be automatable. So again, that is something that you need to keep in mind, right? If your test involves you want to send a text message while you are testing something, or receive a text message, that may not be a great candidate for automation, right? Special issues or special conditions, doing location-aware testing, field testing, again, are types of test cases that you may not automate, right? Basically, this boils down to the test cases that you can and should automate are primarily functional regression tests that that give you the most value from automation. You should definitely look at automating them. Another factor is tests that are stable, or parts of the app that are stable and are going to change less. So again, this is standard automation best practice that not just applies to mobile, it applies to any presentation layer automation where you want to test areas which are more stable and are less likely to change, that you have good understanding on the business processes. Also, the best practice that we like to employ is that we would test which are test cases, pick test cases that are medium complexity, then we go to the high complexity test cases, then we go to low complexity test cases. Similarly, in the smoke test category, we'll go with high priority, medium priority, and low priority test cases. So this is the different characteristics or best practices that we use to identify what test cases we would automate. So what are some of the scripting challenges that we come across typically, and how do we deal with them? How do we deal with fragmentation, right? So as you know, there are genuine issues around doing automation at the user interface level, and those actually get multiplied manifold when you talk about mobile automation. So for example, this slide shows that the two on the same OS, same base OS, which is Android 2.3, on two devices, the screen shows very, very different than each other, right? And if your automation script assumes that it will be shown the same, then you may be in for surprise. So this is an example of how fragmentation impacts you while doing automation. So also the level of differences that may exist in terms of due to just because of the platform and the device form factor could be significant as well, right? So when you write automation scripts, it is very important to design with this problem in mind, where your one functional test case will actually inside it will have to deal with so many different variations in different form factors and different screen resolutions and device types, that if you don't design it like that, you may be in for a lot of surprise, right? So again, this is an example of how form factor impacts the content and how it looks. So, for example, how it looks on Android, two different Android versions, and on an iPhone can be quite different than each other, right? So another important point is that do not do automation on web browsers, and this is particularly applicable for cross-platform applications or mobile web applications, where you may feel that actually testing it on the web browser may suffice, but in reality it's not. Kind of the same thing applies for simulators, right? So on a desktop browser, how an application may look could be quite a bit different than how it looks on an actual device, right? So how do you deal with fragmentation? When we design test cases, right, we basically we develop our automation code in a layered approach. What that means is that at the level of code which is actually interacting with the devices, we implement methods that will actually, or code methods that will actually interact with a specific type of the device, and we write multiple parallel methods like that as components that can be reused in an overarching test case, right? So if a test case script has a requirement to press a button, that button press method could be implemented differently on for different device platforms, right? So by layering our test cases, or layering the code of our test cases at component level which interact with the devices, and at test case level which actually implement the business functionality of the test case, we can address the fragmentation and easily maintain the code, and also extend our test cases when new devices come in, right? So for example, if a brand new device comes in, we may need to write completely new functions to deal with that device's UI, which may be different than other devices on hand, right? So dealing with special conditions. So what do we mean by these special conditions? So as we know, apps misbehave in different conditions that may not be the most optimal conditions in which we develop the application, and these could reflect from how much CPU is being used, how much free memory is available, what network conditions we are in, how are the other apps interacting with your device, what environment conditions we are in. Believe it or not, things like humidity, things like temperature, etc., has an impact on devices' performance, and we have actually seen test cases misbehave or test cases fail because of environment conditions. If your app is using sensors such as ambient light sensor, or it's using camera and stuff like that, light conditions could matter as well, right? So how can we create automation test cases that will reflect some of these conditions on the device and enable us to create test cases that test the device under these conditions. So before we get there, right, we have some of the handy tools that we use frequently to assess what state the device is in. For example, on Android, there is an app called System Panel app or Task Manager app. It's pretty cheap investments that will help significantly in doing automation or doing manual testing. Right. Similarly, on iPhone, there are system and monitoring tools that are available that can be purchased from the App Store. Right. So coming back to this, creating these special conditions, we have developed to aid our automation. We have developed tools components that will get the device into a special condition such that we can then do automation. So we can parameterize our test case to have this component get a device to a certain state, and then we run automated test case, right? So some of the execution best practices. One of the challenges with automation is that test cases will randomly fail, or your automation will stop abruptly when it is executing because of various reasons. There could be test script errors. So there are many reasons test cases will break. So what we have done for all our automated test cases, we have invested in a robust test recovery system. What that means is, if we detect that a test case has failed, or if a test case has more like aborted, we detect that and we can rerun the test case. And that's very important because, as I previously said, the test cases will fail, right? So we have not only, like I said, developed a robust test recovery system, but also we do extensive logging from the test cases so that when a particular test case fails, we can go in and later debug why a particular test case failed, right? This is an example of the amount of logging we would do. This is our report that shows what the test case was doing when it was running, what specific assertions passed, what specific assertions failed. The logs from our test cases also reflect in our report. So we can do a thorough analysis of what that test case went through, and it is readable even by a layperson, somebody who understands the application well. So moving on, continuous integration is another element of managing test execution well. And what this implies is that it always helps creating a test automation management tool that allows one to actually execute the test cases from a CI tool like Jenkins, and run it on a periodic, continuous basis, so you can create some kind of trending across builds, right? So the CI is an effort that has a very easy ROI, very quick ROI. It'll pay off in days, rather than somebody trying to execute these automated test cases manually, and thereby in fact defying the whole reason that you automated this thing, right? So invest in a continuous integration tool and invest in a dedicated set of automation devices against which you can actually do the automation, right? So we have our CI, most of our automation actually test cases running against CI tool Jenkins, which allows us to monitor the test cases executing on a periodic nightly basis. This brings me to the final part of the presentation, which is a quick walkthrough of the case study. which is a mobile web application which allows the users to book a flight. It's basically a travel application. Our automation tech tools actually helped us. We use Selenium to automate it. So we created a test lab with WebDriver installed on individual mobile devices, and we could execute our test cases from a remote CI tool, a Jenkins-based CI tool, where we could actually execute the test cases using the WebDriver on these devices and collect the results in a repository within CI and do reporting off of that. So this is our overall test environment. Some of the technical challenges we came across while automation are as listed here. Selenium WebDriver is something that is still maturing. So the best practice that we learned was to, build the WebDriver code frequently, as frequently as it required to, because they are constantly fixing problems and bugs on the WebDriver, and it helped to kind of take the latest build and build it. Element ID discovery helped us. We needed to kind of find novel ways and interesting ways to identify the elements against which we were automating. So commonly used techniques of XPath and CSS are not supported on all mobile devices. So we had to actually work with the development team to build some testability inside the mobile web application that they were developing. There were differences in terms of the Android WebDriver and on iOS WebDriver, which also we had to recognize and specifically code with. So these were some of the technical challenges we came across. Lessons learned from this case study. So, automation team, it totally makes sense to have them co-located with the development team, particularly in an agile mode where the automation teams can actually interact with the development team. Like I said, there are several conditions or several states in which it is important to build testability into the development code, and therefore it makes sense to co-locate the automation and development teams. I talked about developing the scripts with keeping in mind about fragmentation. So it pays a lot to design the scripts in a very component-oriented way, such that, if things change, if a particular part of the application changes or a new device gets introduced, you are changing it in one place as opposed to changing the script in multiple places. Also, it helped us a lot to actually get an agreement of devices, vendors that we needed to support, because what we identified was doing automation on a brand new device takes its own due course, as we have to redevelop all the components, specific components that particular device, unique components that particular device is going to need. So having a good understanding, there is a lot of churn in Selenium and iOS, Android WebDrivers. So it pays a lot to actually do these builds yourself, such that you can take the evolving changes that are happening on this technology and use that in your automation code. So I would stop here for questions. You can write the questions in the in the WebEx tool, and I would take questions now. So one question is about that I get commonly asked is how do you deal with these special conditions, or when you are interacting with peripherals and interacting with test cases that are actually need to use the peripherals such as a camera, how do you automate those? And there's no easy answer there. You can code your test cases, or you can design your automation test cases such that you can feed some of these interactions to the test case. So for example, if your camera is going to say scan a barcode, and based on that barcode your test case is going to do something, you can actually tweak the test case such that instead of really using the camera, you can have the test case actually read the barcode picture from a file system and do your test case validations against that. So there are several such smart techniques that you can use against your test cases, and thereby thereby kind of proceed with your automation test cases without really having to get stopped against these challenges that are imposed by automation technologies that we have today. Okay, so I don't believe there are any other questions, so I will stop the presentation right now. And I shared my email address in the beginning of the presentation. Please feel free to write questions to me on that email address, and I would be able to respond to them. Thanks for attending this webinar, and we look forward to getting your feedback and having you attend in our future webinars.